Okay, hi. Let's see, it's Tuesday, March 28th, in the morning here on the East Coast. I wanted to do a little video about week 9 and 10, just to make sure we're all back in the saddle after our week off. You'll note that I have up an announcement that highlights the quote or the passage of Professor Robinson in his week 9 lecture. At the very end, he basically talks about where you should be at this point in the course. Um, and I took that passage and put it in an announcement this morning for you. And the question is, are you where he thinks you should be in the course at this point? If you are not, please give me a call, 413-237-7475, and we'll talk through your project and hopefully get you up to speed, right? Because while this is a long course in terms of duration, we really only have a couple of weeks left, and I want to make sure that you folks have focused in on what your project is and the various components of it that you should have at this point. And to that point, right, this is sort of that little, we got here, yeah, the chart that you should be creating and have done somewhere, right? And we're adding columns as we go along in the course here. But let's see, yeah, the work breakdown schedule, right? All the tasks that you're going to have to do in your project, right? And then we're going to talk about what those tasks actually are, the duration of them, the predecessors, thinking about the time schedule then, the Gantt chart, and then we're going to talk about the expertise. Who is it that has to do each of these tasks? And then finally, yes, you have to budget for them, right? And this week's lecture then focuses on on that last column, dealing with the budget. As usual, I thought Professor Robinson did a wonderful job with his lecture video this week, or the PowerPoint slides thing. But I just wanted to comment on a couple of the points he went over, not to correct, but to embellish, based on some of the experience I've had over the years. Okay? Let's see. He starts off talking about direct and indirect costs. And he said that in the book it talks about typically a 12 to 14% indirect cost. And then he went on and talked about research projects that often have indirect costs in 40%, high 40%. And the one point I wanted to make there is that if you're in the social services world and you're trying to get a contract from the government will typically only allow 15% as an indirect overhead cost. Yes, you can apply to the federal government and document that your indirect costs are more than that, and sometimes get a specific document from the government federal government, that says, well, your indirect rate is not 15%, it's really 18 or 19 or 20, whatever it might be. Nevertheless, my agency had such a federal letter like that, but when we went to state and local governments, whatever they said was the limit really was the limit. And you'll have some cases where the grant will prescribe, no, you can't have more than 10% or more than 5% overhead, at which point you may just want to say that that's a deal breaker, and no, we're not going to apply for that grant. Okay? Anyway, just a little bit about the indirect overhead costs there. Let's see. He has talked about personnel cost, and then the fringe amounts. Yes, fringe is typically done on an agency by not an agency meaning the government or the grantor, but on the grantee on an individual basis. right? You figure out um, what the benefits are that you offer your workers, and that's normally a pooled benefit pool, and then you compare the cost of all those benefits to the total cost of your personnel, direct salary costs, and then you get a percentage that the total cost of your fringes are what percentage of your total salaries, and that's typically used as a standard fringe percentage. Um, so what are the fringe, right? It is the FICA costs, right? Those are those government taxes um, that that you have to pay. It's also any pension benefits that you offer your employees. It's also the health and medical benefits that you also um, hopefully give your employees. Okay, so those all go into fringe, and again, it's the total cost of fringe against the total cost of salaries that typically gives you your fringe rate that you can apply as a rule of thumb to all grants. Okay. Um, oh, I skipped two things there. Um, Going back to cost, Professor Robinson talks about partner costs and about how a lot of foundations in particular want you to have matching local revenues. And um, the rationale here from the foundation's point of view is simply that foundations love to um, fund innovative new projects, but they do not uh, like to fund ongoing program expenses. They don't really see that as their role in the big picture. And so their attempt to make sure that you're going to pick up the full cost of the program after the foundation sort of exits after a couple of years is by requiring a matching partner cost up front. Okay, and so you'll also see over time sometimes the foundations will fund a larger percentage in the first years of the grant, and then back out toward the end of the grant on the assumption that you will uh, increasingly fund a larger proportion of the program over time, so that when the foundation actually backs out totally, you'll have the money to actually fund the program going forward. Okay, and we talked about in-kind um, costs last week. Okay, so I'm sorry there. Got a little didn't follow my notes here. I missed it. So we have direct, indirect cost, partner cost, in-kind cost. And then the second big thing that Professor Robinson talks about is personnel costs and the fringe that we just spoke about. The third major thing he talks about is equipment and equipment accounting. Um, One thing he talks about there is the cost of, or the disposal cost, or the, uh, I guess, remaining value cost of a piece of equipment after the grant's over. In other words, you bought a big piece of equipment after 5 years and the grant's up. What are you going to do with that piece of equipment if it still has productive life back in it? My only point with this is that um, my experience working with government contracts and grants is that the government really doesn't want that piece of equipment back at the end of 5 years. The experience I had was that the government, frankly, preferred you to lease equipment so that at the end of the contract there was no question about ownership of that piece of equipment that was bought with the grant but still has some usable life left. Um, Governments really don't want the equipment back again because they just sit in a basement somewhere. They don't know who and how someone could use it, so it just kind of sits there. Hence, again, my experience was that they really preferred you to lease equipment, even if it costs more in the short term. Just my experience. Lastly, then the next point was cost model for purchasing, and really not purchasing, but for cost modeling. The point here is that, and Professor Robinson talks about this again, is that check with your grantor to see what format they want your cost to be put in. In other words, you have your chart, right? That'll say personnel, equipment, yada 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 yada. All the tasks have a cost associated with each. But how you actually show that on your grant submission will depend in large measure on the formatting that your grantor wants. Just to give a very specific example, if you're going to go for a government grant, a state grant, let's say, often those states will have within their state budgeting office their own sort of formatting, their own chart of account that they use for keeping track of expenses across all the agencies, and that budget then rolls up into a statewide state budget that has its own prescribed categories. Okay, and so particularly with state budgets, make sure that you, or state grants rather, make sure you find out from the grantor the format in which they want your individual task costs to be rolled up into, okay? Because they don't want to take your task and cost format and translate it into the state's cost and format. They want you to put your tasks in the state format and then submit it to them, okay? And then I guess just lastly, the budget summaries and narratives. Again, Professor Robinson's really fabulous. I really like his way of presenting material. And as he says, the budget narrative is generally to give people a general idea of the magnitude of the cost and your various cost centers. And then the budget narrative is what you provide backup, so to speak, for each of the major cost centers. Your point here is that you want to let the grantor know that the estimates that you are giving them are well thought out and have credibility, right? You don't have to, go into incredible, granular detail, but the point is you want to convince your grantor that the cost estimates that you're providing are as accurate as can be reasonably expected. And that way they get confidence in you both as a grant writer, but then also as an operational implementer of the grant if you're so lucky to get it. Okay, yes, and lastly he just talks about you want to demonstrate your competence to the grantor. And then I guess just one last little aside, that notion of the 5 W's and an H that we probably all learned back in middle school or junior high when I was in school, public school, is really critical, and it's really interesting how often it comes up. Who, what, where, why, when, and how. That's what people want to know, and if you can share that with them, then they will have confidence in your competence. Okay, 15 minutes, sorry. Okay, so again, if you look at that announcement on where you should be in the course and have any questions there, please give a call. Okay, thanks. So I'll see you online, okay? Or hope to talk with you as well. Thanks.